Okay, we look like we have a critical mass, so I'm going to get us started. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Allison Miller, Director of Science Implementation in Global Science at the Nature Conservancy. Today, we are kicking off the Nature Conservancy's new science webinar series, Science in Action, where we'll be diving into how cutting-edge research and innovation are driving progress towards our 2030 goals to tackle climate change, provide food and water sustainably, and protect our lands, waters, and oceans and fresh water. This series is an exploration of the intersection of climate, biodiversity, and human well-being, featuring TNC scientists and partner experts. Each session will highlight the science shaping conservation and climate strategies, from applied research to data-driven solutions, and why it matters for the future of our planet. Today's event and the entire series is open to both TNC staff and to anyone interested in TNC science. So we especially welcome our partners, colleagues, trustees, and friends to today's session. And now onto the main event. So today's science conversation will be moderated by Katharine Hayhoe, TNC Chief Scientist, and features Sheila Reddy, TNC Global Director and Lead Scientist of Conservation Impact, and Nancy Knowlton, TNC Global Board Member and former Sant Chair of Marine Science at the Smithsonian. Before I turn it over to her, let me briefly introduce Katharine Hayhoe. She's an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding the impacts of climate change on people and the planet. In her role as chief scientist, she ensures that TNC has the scientific knowledge it needs to inform its decisions and shape national and global discussions on addressing the climate and biodiversity crises. Katharine's also a tenured professor at Texas Tech University and has received numerous awards and recognitions for her work, including being named a UN Champion of the Earth. And I will pass it over to Katharine now to introduce our two speakers.
Thank you, Allison. And welcome everyone who is here. I am delighted to see that we have people here from all across the world. If you haven't yet already, you can drop where you're from in the chat, but I see many names from North America, Latin America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, India, and beyond. This is the very first webinar in the series. This webinar is recorded. So if you wanted to share it with someone else, they're always going to be available afterwards. And these webinars will be discussing how we can bring science to tackle the crises of our era, the crises of climate and biodiversity that all stem from our unsustainable use of the resources this planet provides. This very first webinar is called Science for a Better Future, Tackling the Biodiversity and Climate Crises at Scale. And for this webinar, we have two amazing guests. Our first guest is Dr. Nancy Knowlton. She is a global board member for the Nature Conservancy. And when I say global, the Nature Conservancy is in 80 countries around the world. And she is also the Emeritus Sant Chair for Marine Science from the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. So Nancy is very well known for being a pioneering coral reef ecologist. And in fact, last year I had the privilege of actually going snorkeling with Nancy around a restored coral reef and having her share which type of corals are most threatened by climate change and how restoration can really make a difference. So she is a pioneer in researching the ecology, the evolution, and the behavior of marine systems and coral reefs. She also founded the Earth Optimism series at the Smithsonian a number of years ago, and that is how I met Nancy. Because years before, social science researchers told us that it was so important to instill efficacy and hope in order to spur climate action, Nancy already knew that. So she was hosting Earth Optimism summits at the Smithsonian Museum, and that is how we connected because I spoke at one of those virtually. So Nancy has also won, as you can imagine, a lot of awards. She's been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and received many recognitions, and we're so grateful to have her with us here today. Welcome, Nancy. Our second panelist is Dr. Sheila Reddy. Sheila is the Global Director and Lead Scientist of Conservation Impact here at the Nature Conservancy. And so she thinks every day about how we could do our science better, how we can integrate better data and learning into our management, how we can learn not just from our successes, but from our mistakes. We often learn even more from those. And she is the one responsible for embedding learning and impact data into all of our management processes. Her own research often focuses on things like soil carbon strategy, transforming our own sustainability within the organizations, and influencing policies and programs focused on poverty and ecosystem health. Sheila is an associate editor for the journal Conservation Science and Best Practice, and her work at the intersection of economics and ecology has won many awards. Welcome, Sheila. So, if you don't mind, I would love to just start with asking you to share your story. So, Nancy, could you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to go into a career in science in the first place? And what did the trajectory of your career look like? Because the one thing I've learned is there's often no one pathway for everyone. So, in very brief, we could do this for 5 hours, I'm sure, but very briefly, what drew you to this work and how has that developed and changed over your life?
Well, I grew up most of the time near the ocean, and actually I've been interested in science for as long as I can remember. So I can't actually say why I wanted to be a scientist, because I've always wanted to be a scientist. Started off in astronomy, but I eventually got sidetracked into biology. And I guess much of my career is sort of a standard academic science career. As you mentioned, I'm a coral reef scientist. I worked for my PhD in Jamaica, and that actually, in a way, is what pushed me in the direction of conservation, because within about 10 years of my being there as a graduate student, the reefs had basically disappeared through a combination of bad things that happened. And so throughout my whole career, I've sort of been mixing basic science and thinking about the conservation of all these ecosystems that I love that were disappearing around the planet, and often being able to link them. For example, some of my most famous work was on the diversity of the little plants that live inside corals and how they're sensitive to different temperatures, which is very related now, of course, to the future of coral reefs in the context of global bleaching. So it's for much of my career until TNC, it was kind of an academic mixture of a basic and applied research.
So I began my career in astronomy and physics as well. I think a lot of us have started there and then gone more into science that directly impacts the health of this planet and people's well-being. So Sheila, what about your pathway? Where did you begin? What drew you to science, and how has that changed over time?
Yeah, thinking back, there's been a couple key moments that have shifted my path. And one of the first ones was as a kid, a teenager, sitting on my parents' couch in Wisconsin, reading Outside Magazine. I don't know if people have seen this, but I was into whitewater kayaking and I heard about these so-called conservation biologists that were changing the flows of the Colorado River to restore ecosystems. I thought, wait, this is a job? You can do that? Turns out those are actually TNC scientists. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to a place that has a program for conservation biology and whitewater kayaking, and that was Stanford University. Fast forward, I'm a conservation biologist. I'm down in the Mesoamerican reef, second largest reef, barrier reef in the world, helping inform the design of marine protected areas in a way that can help them better be resilient to climate change. So not just protecting the big, beautiful places, but also those ones that are more resistant and resilient to coral bleaching that aren't always the ones that get picked for marine reserves. And that was really exciting. But I had this moment then, this is one of my next kind of pivot moments, where I thought, gosh, I think I really need to be understanding the drivers of this change more to help towards solutions. And so I thought I need to study economics. And this is an important moment. I intersected with Nancy, and Nancy was starting a PhD program, a joint between the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the economics department at UC San Diego. Is really one of the first programs like that. And they worked on at the intersection of poverty and ecosystem health, trying to understand how we develop conservation programs and policies that serve both of those outcomes. And once I went through a PhD and a postdoc, I came to TNC because I saw it as the place where I could really do science and do it in a way that I was working with partners and driving towards tangible results. And I'm happy to still be here today.
That's so interesting. I'm glad I'm not the only one. Part of how I picked my graduate school is because they had a sailing club. As well as a good program in atmospheric science. So Sheila, here at TNC, what is your science role here? If you had to give the 30-second elevator version to a non-technical, somebody you just ran into in the elevator, what would you say that you do at TNC?
Yeah, sure thing. So we are trying to help address the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. And like a lot of organizations and communities and corporations, we have big goals to try to help us contribute to those solutions. And what I do is look across the whole organization to see how we're doing in terms of making progress on those goals, what we're learning, where we need to focus each year. That's that big picture view. And then we also dive deep with our teams across the 80 countries where we work to build our capacity and do strategic science to really essentially ask the basic question of, is what we're doing working? How can we make it more impactful? And how can we have that impact be durable because it integrates equity?
And that's such an important question that often we don't ask, because in science, we're driving for results. We want to find out the answers to our questions. But what makes the Nature Conservancy different, and speaking for myself, this is a big part of what attracted me to the Nature Conservancy, is it isn't only about doing the science, it's about implementing it to make a real world difference. And we know in science, there's always factors we didn't consider. There's always unexpected, we humans react to things very differently. And so we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually working. And so I just feel like what you do is so important. Nancy, what drew you to the Nature Conservancy? Like I said, we met when you were at Smithsonian. I was serving on the board of the Smithsonian Natural History Museum myself. What does your science role look like at TNC as a global board member?
Well, I was actually asked by the former CEO to join the board. Kind of, for me, it felt like out of the blue, but I guess there was some preparation that went into the invitation. Obviously, because, as I said, I've seen so much bad things happen, not just to the coral reefs, but to the oceans at large. And by then I was very much involved in the whole, as you mentioned, Earth Optimism Summit. Before then, I launched a Twitter campaign, #OceanOptimism. And even before that at Scripps, started a symposia called Beyond the Obituary. So I'd been very interested in solutions for a long, long time. And so the combination of the science approach of TNC as a scientist obviously appealed to me, but also the focus on solutions and working with people to find common ground. I mean, I think there's a role for a lot of different ways of approaching the conservation climate needs of the planet, but it just felt like a really good fit, the approach that TNC used. And so I was absolutely delighted to be asked. And in fact, after joining the TNC board, I also was asked to be a trustee for the Maine chapter. So I also sit as a Maine trustee as well, which is it's complementary and very interesting in terms of similarities and differences.
Excellent. And I heard you mentioning social media campaigns. Social media is really an important way, I think, to spread information. And these days, Blue Sky is really where a lot of the science is. And Nancy, you're even on Blue Sky yourself, aren't you?
I am. I've been pulling as many people over there as I can.
There, I'll put the link to your account right there so people can find you.
Okay, yeah. It's a great place. There are a lot of people working in conservation that are having good conversations there. So it's, I recommend it.
I completely agree. For many years, I maintained a list on Twitter of scientists who study climate-related topics, and it maxed out at about 3,300 people, scientists of all different, across the physical, social, life sciences, about 2 or 3 years ago. I recreated that same list on Blue Sky, and we're already up to 4,500 scientists on Blue Sky. So that's where you can, if you like the science, that's where you can go to learn more about this. All right. At the Nature Conservancy, though, we often say, and in fact, this is one of the first things I ever heard about the Nature Conservancy, and you might have heard that too. People say we're a science-based organization. So the three of us do very different things within the organization, but all of what we do is very relevant to science. So my question to you is, and Sheila, I'll ask you this first, what does it mean to you that the Nature Conservancy is a science-based organization, and how do you see that reflected in our day-to-day work?
Sure. Well, I think it's a really exciting time to be at the Nature Conservancy as a science-based organization, because what it means is that science is embedded in every step of what we do. So we work in a way that's about adaptive management. Identify the biggest problems, develop strategies to solve them. But then, those strategies aren't going to always play out the way that, you expect. So you have to learn along the way. And that's where science is really focused, more so now than ever before. And then when we're having an impact, that we can really stand behind it with our values of integrity beyond reproach, that we're confident that it is having the impact for nature and people that we expect. And this is a pretty cool evolution, because as I think about it, when I was first learning about the Nature Conservancy, we had our history as a land trust in the United States. We were started by scientists. In fact, we used information about where the most important lands were for biodiversity, and we went out and bought them. And so at that time, it was a lot more straightforward. You ecologically important places, how many acres you protected, how much money you spent. But nowadays, we are addressing issues around climate change. We are addressing issues about providing food and water sustainably to people, empowering Indigenous and local communities to lead in conservation. And so we need to be taking an approach with science that integrates the natural and social sciences, local and Indigenous knowledge, technology throughout what we do, because it requires so much more learning and it's a more complex set of problems.
And what people might not realize is, in the Nature Conservancy's work across every US state, Canada, and 80 other countries around the world, about 20% of our staff are scientists or science staff. So we have over 1,000 scientists and science staff. And the interesting thing is, about 60% of those are what we would call practicing scientists. So scientists who spend a significant chunk of their time doing research, analyzing data, sort of other sciencey tasks. But about 40% are science staff or non-practicing scientists who might be, leading leading TNC's work in a given state, or they might be working in IT or in the HR or people team, but they have a science background. And so I think it's just really interesting that we have people with, a master's degree in wildlife ecology leading our HR team, or people who have that scientific perspective really embedded in every part of what we do. And I think that's really unusual for an organization like this. So Nancy, you sort of sit at the 30,000-foot view on the global board. You get this overview of sort of, and the sample of what's going on all around the world. So when you hear people say the Nature Conservancy is a science-based organization, what would you say that means?
Well, I'd say that when we think about what projects to undertake, there are basically three things we have to think about. One is the goal in terms of important in the context of conservation. And the second is, are the approaches likely to yield success? And the third is, how much will it cost and how will we raise the money and sort of guarantee all the sort of financial, legal, kind of business side of the operation. I don't have much, if anything, to say on the latter, but I have a lot to say on the first two, the first one particularly, but also the strategies as well, particularly when they're, because TNC is science-based, the strategies are science-based. And so whenever we're discussing, as you say, it's a high altitude view, and it's only a tiny, tiny fraction of all the projects that are going on, but they're usually the important ones, or the ones that, require some serious decision making. And so I can contribute in that way. And then I also chair the Conservation and Science Committee, where we get to dig deeper into more projects, and working with TNC staff, you, Sheila, David Banks, and other people to sort of really dig into the places. And I think most importantly, the ones where, and Sheila will get into this more later, the ones where we're actually having challenge, where we really, some things just sort of are pretty straightforward, are going to work, almost inevitably. Others are more challenging, and that's where the science perspective comes in. And as a board member, there are plenty of board members that actually are scientists by training. We have very distinguished physicists and doctors, but I'm kind of the point person for the sort of biology of conservation. And that's a pretty important role to play given what we're trying to do.
It absolutely is. And I should also add that we have just at the Nature Conservancy recognizing that Nancy and the others on the global board, we need more science input than they can provide. So we just asked Nancy to head up our brand new External Science Advisory Council that we've set up with experts in topics, science-related topics around the world that are really at the cutting edge of what we need to know to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises. So the Nature Conservancy has a lot of ecologists, conservation biologists, people who understand forests and wetlands and animals and freshwater. But increasingly, we need to understand human behavior. We need to understand social science. I myself, I'm a climate scientist. We also need to understand how to integrate Indigenous science with Western science. We need to understand economics like Sheila does and governance. And so Nancy, in addition to all the hats she's already wearing, is also chairing a brand new External Science Advisory Council as well. Okay.
We just met in Mexico. So we're just, I mean, we really just have met each other. And so I'm really looking forward to that new role that I have as well.
Exactly. So for example, like how do you integrate new biodiversity monitoring technologies, like eDNA and bioacoustic monitoring? How do we integrate that into our work? We need people who are at the cutting edge because we don't have a lot of time. And in fact, at the Nature Conservancy, we have these really ambitious 2030 goals. And these 2030 goals have numbers on them. So there's 6 goals. Number 1 is to reduce or store 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide yearly through managing nature. And just for context, all of us humans produce just over 40 gigatons a year. So for one organization to say 3, that's a huge chunk of global emissions. We want to benefit the 100 million people most at risk from climate impacts, ensuring food and resources and a safe place to live, conserving nearly 10 billion acres of ocean, 1.6 billion acres of land, 620,000 miles of rivers, enough to wrap around the world 25 times, supporting local stewards who steward our land and our water. And so, Sheila, you have a huge role to play in the learning that helps us quickly adapt to accelerate our progress towards these goals. So what are the most important factors that you've seen in really helping us to learn and to be much more effective at focusing on the work we do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's been a really exciting journey. These goals have been really motivational to us, and it was transformational because they're helping us, be more ambitious, but also recognize that we need to learn. And that's a big, important mindset to bring to your work, is that kind of humbleness of, okay, we have a great track record and we know how to ask and answer important questions. We may not always have the answers today, but by always having that mindset of, are we having the greatest impact? What could we be doing a little bit differently? How can we learn and reflect, not just as an organization, but also with our partners? That's really the guiding thing that I think has been so important, is trusting the fact that we are a science-based organization, and that'll help us find the path to greatest impact, and doing so with partners. I mean, those are big, big numbers, and they're big because we know that we're going to achieve them not just by ourselves, but through our work with partners and through influencing policy and markets, for example.
So let's actually get down to an example, because this was sort of talking high level about all the different projects around the world. Nancy, one of your favorite examples, and one of mine too, is our work on fire in Oregon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so last year, the Global Board actually met in Oregon to do general board stuff, but also specifically to learn more about this incredible program. And I think all of you who are listening know how critical understanding, controlling, reducing highly destructive fires is for the United States and also for around the world. We can't, it's always been in the background, but right now it's actually right in the foreground as well. So I thought that this example is really important. We went there and we met with a lot of different people, scientists, forest managers, Indigenous representatives, And they told us about the research they were doing to figure out how to reduce the severity of forest fires in Oregon. This is a place that's pretty dry and has trees that are quite flammable once they get started. So you really do have to worry about mega fires there. And what they've been doing is figuring out how to combine sort of clearing of brush with thinning of trees to minimize the damage that's caused by fires, because fires are going to happen. It's a question of managing the fires so they don't get out of control and do too much damage. And one particular, and so this is, good science with, trying this out in multiple places called replication, so that we know that this is a proper experiment. But one of the most memorable parts of seeing the results of that experiment was walking down a road at the site, and on the left-hand side had been the forest that had been subjected to all these treatments, and the right-hand side was forest that had not been managed at all. And on the right-hand side, everything was burned to a crisp. On the left-hand side, there were these beautiful trees with needles and leaves there. So it was a very vivid visual demonstration of the effectiveness of this strategy, the science for which has been developed with TNC and its partners, and implemented by TNC as partners, including Indigenous groups in the area. So it's a really striking example of all the good things about science at TNC and how it's executed. And to see that beautiful, healthy forest having had a fire that swept through it but did so much less damage was really inspiring.
And that picture is so powerful. So I put a link in the chat. If anybody wants to see what that actually looks like, there are pictures and a video that I just put in the chat that shows the striking difference between a forest that has been managed by prescribed burns, which is an Indigenous traditional forest management practice, versus forest that has not been managed. What happens when a wildfire sweeps through? Night and day. Sheila, what were you going to add?
Well, I was going to say, we had a similar experience last summer walking through forests in Colorado with my staff, and specifically Teresa Chapman, one of our experts. And it is just astounding, like the differences you see when a place where a fire came through, but the places that were treated look so much healthier. And now, actually, it was in fact just on Tuesday, we got together with a team that is trying to now look across entire landscapes, 11 states in the Western US, and say, okay, where has all this fire management been done? And how can we look at the patterns of management together with the patterns of fire severity and understand how is this management leading to reduced fire severity? And use that information to guide all this money that's coming from the government and our partners into forest management, so that we're really spending that money effectively, so that it has the biggest impact across landscapes. And this matters. We all know, unfortunately, through the news, like how much this matters to people and communities, as well as to nature, to get this right. And that is sort of the power, I think, of TNC, where we can look at these big scales and figure out what's working and help drive these kind of solutions at a scale that's going to really transform things.
It is. And I think it's really important to emphasize, you might have heard sort of Nancy and Sheila allude to this, but it's important to emphasize this is not just about nature, it's about people too. We live together with nature. And in the case in Oregon that Nancy was talking about, there's a tribal nation there that had lost the management rights to their own land. And they had lost the tradition of managed burning that their own nation had been doing in the past. And so they're partnering with the Nature Conservancy in Oregon to retrain. And in fact, they're the ones doing most of the prescribed burning, to retrain their people and their young people to do these burns, to show that they are perfectly capable of managing their land and to get those rights back from the federal government. And so it really is about empowering local communities. It's not about coming in and telling people what to do. It's about asking what can we help with, what needs to be done. And this is a lot of what we do in Canada too, is the Nature Conservancy in Canada, known as Nature United in Canada, works behind the scenes with our First Nations, asking, what do you need? What resources do you need that we can help with? What training do you need that we can help with? What can we do to help you manage your land? And that's really an important part of what we do, I think, around the world, is working with those local communities. And that's a lot of our learning too, isn't it?
Yeah, and then, another thing that's so exciting from where I sit in the organization is getting to see all these things happening around the world. So we've mentioned these examples in Oregon, then across the Western United States, then Canada. Well, in fact, we also have similar programs that are learning from each other, such as in Australia, where we're supporting Indigenous groups, Aboriginal groups to lead around traditional fire methods, to shift burning to a time when it's less severe, and critically also making sure that there's sustainable financing for this. So through a carbon fund. And so putting all those pieces together of empowering local communities, understanding that deep ecology and local knowledge about when fire can be beneficial, and then making sure that that can be sustained through good government policy and financing. And it's just so cool to see all of the learning that happens when you've got an organization that's all over the world and science-based.
And I love too that you mentioned finance and policy. Again, a lot of people might think it's an organization of conservation biologists, and we certainly have our share, but there's so many people, so many experts that I'm still meeting new people, and I've been here for 3 years, who are experts in public policy. They're experts in legislation at the federal or the state or the city level. They're experts in finance, unlocking innovative finance mechanisms, like figuring out how to write an insurance policy for coral reefs. Like, that's just wild. And if the Nature Conservancy isn't doing it, who is? And so I just love that there's this really creative, innovative ways to scale what we're doing beyond actual hands on the ground to providing the conditions, the policy and the financial conditions that would allow communities to do often what they want to do, what they need to do, but they just don't have the ability to do in today's current environment. Okay, so this question is very important, and then we'll go to some audience questions. So don't forget to be putting your questions in the Q&A. Allison is going to be going through them and getting a few of them. But this is a really important question. None of us get it right all the time. In fact, the definition of being human is that we are not perfect. So how are we uncovering what doesn't work, and how are we learning from those failures? Nancy, can you share an example?
Well, actually, I was in thinking about this topic. I did a little reading and specifically on how we learn from success and failure, and it's very interesting because the scientific literature is increasingly paying attention to this, and that's why the work that Sheila and her team and others are doing is so important. Because traditionally, people haven't wanted to talk about successes. I think NGOs have in particular been sort of unwilling to talk, not willing to talk about failures, and NGOs in particular have been reluctant to talk about failures because, but scientists as well, no one really likes to talk too much about what didn't work because it makes you kind of look bad on one level, but in fact, it's an incredibly important opportunity to learn. And recent analyses have suggested that about 2/3 of conservation actions actually work, which I think is a pretty good number when you consider, say, the number of businesses that start. Restaurants in New York, 2/3 of them definitely don't work. So 2/3 isn't too bad. But when you think about what causes them to fail, the patterns are really interesting. I mean, in some cases, it's basic natural science, either the theory didn't work. For example, you trying to protect a seahorse and you set up a marine protected area, and the marine protected area protects even better the things that eat seahorses than the seahorses themselves. And so the seahorses do worse as a function of protection rather than better. Or you're trying to get rid of an invasive seaweed, and in the process, you wind up spreading it everywhere instead of getting rid of it. So sometimes it's the basic biology that we don't get right. And this is particularly true when we're actually meddling directly in nature, adding things, taking things away, because there's so much diversity, and it's really easy to you can't know everything about everything. And sometimes basically things, you just get surprises and they result in things not working. Sometimes it doesn't work because it's not done at a big enough scale. That's also often the biology. They get edge effects, things like to be really protected. They don't like to be at the edge of protected areas, or you have, large animals need a certain amount of space. And if you don't give them, if you give them too small space, it's really not any better than no space at all, that sort of thing. Sometimes it's hard you've got positive feedback loops that are making things worse, that are really take extra effort, especially big efforts that people didn't realize. But what's really interesting to me, so that's part of the failures, but much bigger chunk of the failures has to do with the intersection of natural sciences and social sciences. And it's when people don't respond the way we expect them to do, more than when animals and plants don't respond. And then finally, the other thing that causes things to fail is either because they work in small pieces, but they don't scale, or maybe they scale, but they don't break even financially. And that in the long run is really necessary for sort of sustainable scalability. So really it's why it's so important that you've brought the social sciences into TNC in a really big way, Katharine, and then of course the social science background of Sheila as well, because I'd say the biggest chunk of the things that we have to learn about have to be with learning about what people did that we didn't expect, rather than what animals and plants did that we didn't expect.
I completely agree with you, Nancy. In fact, I feel like one of the things that people often don't know about climate science, because I work in climate projections, and I was actually just asked this yesterday. They said, but what about all the uncertainties in climate models and clouds and physics? And I said, well, yes, those uncertainties exist, but the biggest uncertainty in our future is the choices we make. Humans are the number one uncertainty, 8 billion of us making decisions that affect our planet. And that actually relates to a question that Valerie asked. She said, what about, if we're working on coral reefs, what about factors outside our control, like ocean warming, bleaching, disease? And that's why I think it's so important to combine both of those. Like, I, as a climate scientist, can say, look, I'm really sorry, but in this area, I don't know, given what you tell me, Nancy, that we're going to be able to have any coral restoration here long term. But what our scientists are doing, in collaborating with Woods Hole and Smithsonian and others, is trying to identify supercorals that can survive in much warmer conditions. And then the climate science can identify where the conditions would still persist in the future. And so by putting together those different layers of knowledge, we can increase the chances of success, rather than if one of us just did it by ourselves. Sheila, I feel like, you could give an entire semester-long course on everything we've learned from everything we've got wrong. Is there an example that you would highlight? Just one example of something we got wrong that we really learned from?
Yeah, I would love to highlight that. And then to build on Nancy too, Nancy's point about the questions about people, we gathered a lot of our scientists who's focused on the evaluation part of our work, and pretty much all their top questions were about people. So how are people making decisions? How are people benefiting? How are people getting empowered? It's so important. And I want to talk about an example around sustainable agriculture. So we're trying to promote practices that can help sequester carbon, can lead to cleaner water, and hopefully also be better for farmers and people in the communities. We do this in a lot of places. We're doing some deep dives in India, in Colombia, and we've also done this in the US Corn Belt or Midwest. And that's the example I'll talk about. We had this moment where we kind of took a pause and okay, let's kind of update our strategy here. It's so important to pause and do that. And we were looking at this map. TNC folks love maps. And we were like, wow, the majority of these lands that are contributing to nutrient pollution in these waterways are actually rented, meaning the person who owns them is not actually the farmer. And we've been talking to the farmer. We haven't been talking to the landowner. And I thought, okay, wait a minute. We need to develop a whole new strategy around that. We need to be reaching out to these folks. We need to bring them into this conversation. And luckily we had some science innovation funds to basically kind of embed learning into the development and testing of this new strategy. There's a lot to say, lots of papers published on this too. But what I'll share is we we ended up kind of running this as a trial program, like where we were kind of offering different things. That we were offering information, guidance to like take steps to have conversations with your farmer, different lease templates, because through a lot of social science research, we were like, oh, these lease terms are really making people focus on the near term and not like the long-term benefits. And we also offered financial incentives. And the great thing is, rather than just kind of do that all at once and then, wonder if it worked, we did it like an experiment. And so we were able to learn a lot. And I hate to say it, but I'm also proud to embrace this failure, so to speak, is that we just didn't move the needle on adopting these sustainable agriculture practices. But by designing it as an experiment, we were able to see, okay, wait, folks did take some of these first steps to have conversations. There was some interest in the financial incentive. So then we were able to rapidly go back, offer a greater financial incentive, think about who the right messenger was. And so by having that failure and designing that work in a way that we could learn, we were able to adjust and then see what could we do differently to move the needle. And I'm happy to say that the insights from that and that program have actually influenced corporate-led programs related to soil carbon on these kind of lands. And so I think, need more and more of that kind of approach where we are saying we don't always know the answer, and so we need to design our programs in a way that we can learn and deliver impact at the same time.
Exactly. Adaptive learning, sort of like doing something, evaluating it, learning, modifying it, doing it better, learning. And the thing is the world is changing so quickly. Climate has never changed this fast in the history of humans on this planet. And, with the biodiversity crisis, pollution crises, geopolitical changes, what even worked 5 years ago might not work today. So it isn't a case of like getting it right and setting it in stone. Even if we get it right today, we have to keep evaluating it because the world is changing so fast, it might not work again in the future. So that adaptive learning is just absolutely essential to not only achieving goals, but sustaining goals. It's like you get to the finish line, but if you don't work on staying there, you could end up sliding backwards. Well, we have a ton of great questions. People have been upvoting the questions, posting them in the chat and the Q&A. So Allison, do you have a couple of questions that you could summarize for us? I know that we have some questions that are sort of grouped together on the same topic. What do you have?
I do. We have quite a few questions. So I'm going to start with a question that circles back to some of the examples that you talked about, which is around wildfire. So a question around the science of recovery from wildfire. What do we know? What are we learning? What can we do?
Oh, I can jump in here. It's a great question. And I had a chance during one of those recent visits to Colorado to also walk through an area where we're doing some experiments around seeding versus planting saplings, and really which one of those is more effective for recovery. But there was an even kind of deeper and more interesting story there around how we get the seeds. So sometimes the fires are so destructive that there isn't natural regeneration. And some staff were working on opportunities to do replanting, but they realized there wasn't necessarily a seed bank to tap into. And so that's one of these important insights where, we will have to understand the biology enough, but then also kind of have the operations to be able to move when the time is right to reseed and have that on hand. So we, I think, have a lot to learn about recovery, and we hope to prevent destruction, but this is an important frontier area, not only in forests, but Nancy has a special interest in recovery and learning corals and other ecosystems.
And then for urban, we're all thinking of the terrible ongoing wildfires in LA. They still have them today. A lot of that is driven by urban expansion into areas that are already known to be extremely fire prone, and the pervasive invasive species. So not native species, but invasive species that burn very differently. a disaster is a function not just of the hazard itself, the wildfire, but how many people and how much infrastructure is exposed and how prepared and resilient or how vulnerable it is. So at the Nature Conservancy, we don't only work in sort of remote, forest or grassland or marine areas. We actually work in cities also. Because nature has a huge role to play, and in future webinars we'll get into this. Nature has a huge role to play in helping us become more resilient to extreme heat, to flooding, and even to wildfire in urban areas.
Thanks, Katharine. I'm going to move on to another question, just pivoting a little bit. There are a number of questions about career growth, like how do scientists, young scientists, move up the path to get into leadership roles like yourselves? Could you provide a little career advice to those listening?
Nancy, what would you say?
It's funny because right now I'm writing. I was asked by the Annual Review of Marine Science to write a piece on my career. So I don't think there's any single answer to this question. But for me, what has worked has been to pay attention to the exceptions and take advantage of opportunities as they arise. So some people have careers that are very linear, that, they say, I want to learn this problem. They understand this problem. So they understand, they said, okay, that means I need to know this. And that means I need to know this. And their whole career is sort of like a linear progression from point to point in a kind of pre-planned way. I, on the other hand, started working on corals because I was in Jamaica during Hurricane Allen, which took the reefs and smashed them into something that looked more like a parking lot than a coral reef. And then later, I was very lucky to discover things that happened just because of a chance bleaching event that I was there for, coupled with the fact that we'd surveyed the reefs 9 months earlier. And my whole career, as I'm sort of like 3/4 way going through this, has been sort of recognizing when things don't make sense, realizing their importance, and to do that, there's the wonderful quote from Louis Pasteur, chance only favors the prepared mind. And so I would say that it's my ability to recognize the significance of things that are different, unexpected, unplanned, has to do with the fact that I read really widely. And so my career advancement has really been, and then the other thing I would say is it's really important to know how to communicate. And this is something Katharine works on a lot. You really need to know how to speak. You need to know how to write, or some combination. No one is born a genius at it. Some people might find it easier or more comfortable to begin with than others, but it's really worth making an investment in learning how to communicate clearly, because you can have the best ideas in the world and the most exciting findings in the world, and if you bury them in undigestible prose, they won't have the impact they should.
Oh my goodness. I second, third, and fourth that so strongly. And I love Linda's comment in the chat too, that storytelling is huge. So yeah, if people don't understand why it matters, why would they care? And so if we understand why it matters, whoever we are, whatever it is we understand, it's our job to help tell that story. Sheila, what advice would you give? A lot of people are asking sort of, how do I make a difference? How can I use what I do to make a difference? What would you say?
Well, building on some of what Nancy said, I'll tell personally that other than the job I got hired into at the Nature Conservancy, my jobs did not exist until I proposed them. So what the lesson from that is, see the need, right? There was like, look around and see what is it that is really needed to help have an impact, to help solve certain problems. And that's what I've tried to do, is see where are we going globally? Where are we going as an organization? And how can I help by kind of pushing there and contributing what I have the best ability to contribute? And I think there's a couple key ingredients to that. And that is really keeping in mind always like what is going to be most needed by folks trying to implement solutions. How is it going to help them answer key questions about what's working and what they need to do next? And then also still having a lot of conviction about like what you believe are the important questions. You are also a scientist who can recommend, maybe you should be thinking about this, or this might not have been on your radar, or this could be a surprising consequence that we should be considering. So both listen to what people need and also advocate for what you as a scientist believe is going to be important. And then lastly, it is communication. I still remember so much when I first left the science function, which is a whole other story, and joined the chief strategy office, which was kind of a risky move, but one that I took because I was like, I think through combining science and management, I can have a bigger impact. And my boss at the time essentially coached me that, as you advance in your roles, you are going to rely on verbally communicating to people very quickly something important. And that has been such a critical thing for me, because sure, you have to have the credentials and the science to back it all up, but it's going to be in 30 seconds, 1 minute, a 7-minute presentation that you need to get someone's attention and help them see what is the action that they need to take. And that takes some practice. And that's a powerful communication that Nancy was also talking about.
Absolutely. And I often get, I still teach at the university, and I often get a lot of students ask me what they should study if they want to make a difference. And my answer is, it echoes very much what you've said. Study what you love, what you're passionate about, because we need everybody to help build a sustainable future. And I love Andrea's question at the top. She said, how do you see the Nature Conservancy moving from a science-based organization towards a knowledge-based organization? We need knowledge across the spectrum. So every day I work with people who have knowledge in communication or in marketing or in writing, people who have knowledge in implementation or in community organizing. We need everybody. So study whatever it is that you love, what you're passionate about, and then look for a way that you can make a difference. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson one of my good colleagues has this great TED Talk where she talks about 3 circles. The first circle is what needs to be done, and it's a very big circle. The second circle is what you are uniquely good at, which not a lot of other people are. Each of us has unique abilities and talents. But then the third circle I love is what gives you joy. And that can change over time. So look for the intersection of what needs to be done, what you are good at, and what gives you joy. And that is where you can make the biggest difference. So we have a lot of more great questions. And there's really good questions about, we have a brand new One Health, Planetary and Human Health program at TNC. We will have an upcoming webinar on that topic. There is a lot of interest in education, formal and informal education in young people. We have programs at the Nature Conservancy, including Nature Lab, that focuses on that. And that would be another great topic for an upcoming webinar. Let's see, I feel like there was one more too. Even one fully on careers, like how do different people come to what they're doing here now? To find out more, Allison has put a link to our science newsletter in the chat. It goes out once a month, and it just highlights some of the science we're doing around the world. So anybody's welcome to subscribe to it and sign up. I encourage you to do so. And I'm going to end this webinar now with one last question. And the honor of that last question goes to Christine, because I think she asked a really great question. She says, if you were to boil down one thing you wish the general public knew or understood or did about the climate and biodiversity crisis, what would it be? Who wants to go first?
I will definitely.
Okay.
With my whole last 15 years, it's not too late. It's really never too late, and you can make a difference. Don't let doom and gloom and frustration and anger consume you, because positive action has such an important role to play.
I love that, Nancy, and especially coming from you as a coral reef ecologist, because coral is at the forefront of it's too late. And so to have somebody who's dedicated their life to this say it's not too late and what we can do to make a difference, I just think is so powerful. Sheila, what would you say? What do people need to know?
Well, I would say it's that humans are, we're kind of amazing. It's scary, right? How we're changing the world, but we also have the power to completely change our culture, institutions, how we live. And we have the ability to solve problems. We will solve this problem. And then each of us can be part of that. Sure, there's these the daily things you can do in your household, but I also really encourage people to ask, like, what is it you can do in your workplace? Like, be that leader in your workplace, or be that leader in your community, or even just within your friends network, or in how you spend your money or invest your money. So there are a lot of ways in which we have power that we don't even think about. And I encourage everyone to take those actions and be optimistic around the power of people to solve problems.
Absolutely. I often say it's not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It's quite literally about saving us. And so that means that if we are a human being living on this planet, we have every reason we need to care. And I love what you said, Sheila, because what we as individuals can do is so important that I have a list pinned to the top of my Instagram account, my Threads account, my Blue Sky account. I have this list pinned there of, according to the social science, the most effective things individuals can do to make a difference. And you said them. Use our voice to catalyze change where we live, where we work, join a climate action group to magnify our voice, consider where we keep our money, use our voice to talk to elected officials, and use our voice to make change contagious. Change has happened before, and the only way it's ever happened before is when individuals use their voice to call for that change. So that is what I think all of us are doing with the abilities we have. And thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Sheila, for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you, everyone who joined us, for your amazing questions. Please share this. The link will be available. Sign up for our science newsletter and tune into the next one. We're taking your suggestions on what you want to hear about next. Thank you.
Thank you.